Thank you, everybody. And yes, welcome to Our Future Environment is the title of this Q&A session that we've got today. So the idea is that we're going to have a discussion. I wouldn't really call it a debate, but it's a Q&A where people have sent in their questions in advance. Thank you to those of you that have done that. And our panel here are going to talk about the key environmental questions that we face around plastic pollution, around farming, climate change, and extinction. And so we're going to introduce these questions, and our panel are going to answer them as best they can. And then at various points throughout the evening, we're going to open it up to you and get some opinions from the audience. So if you want to contribute, please put your hands up. We've got people going round with microphones. And so hopefully we'll get a good discussion going. Just to say, this event has been organised entirely by a set of PhD students at the University of East Anglia, who are funded by the Natural Environment Research Council. So they've organised the entire event, done it themselves, and we've got three fantastic PhD students who are doing environmental research on our panel tonight. So, to introduce our panel, on the end here, we have got Camilla Ryan, who is a third-year PhD student at the University of East Anglia and the Earlham Institute in Norwich, which is a centre for genomics. Camilla's going to tell you a little bit about her research in a second. In the middle, we've got Vicky Dewar-Fowler, who is a PhD student at the British Antarctic Survey. And here we've got Sarah Barnsley, who is a PhD student in the School of Biological Sciences at the University of East Anglia. So, if we could just give a round of applause for our panel, because I think what they're doing tonight is super brave, and as you'll see, they're fantastic. So I think how we're going to start off is that each of the panel are going to just talk to you for a minute or two about what they do, and then you can ask any questions about that, and then we'll get going with the public Q&A. So, who wants to go first? Camilla.
Good evening, everyone. Yeah. Hi, as you said, I'm Camilla, and I'm joint PhD with the Earlham Institute and University of Anglia. Now, currently, I'm in the third year of my PhD and studying an endangered bird called the pink pigeon. There's about 400 of them left. But I actually study their genetics, their DNA. That's what really interests me. Although previously, I have worked abroad on primates, predators, and endangered species products, particularly in Africa. But yes, so today I use genetic methods, is the dream, to try and work out the best management plans for endangered species. And this is particularly important when you consider biodiversity loss, because that includes everything from genetic loss up to the loss of species or populations. I can tell you a little bit more. I don't know how much you want this.
Yeah, let's go for a bit more.
Okay, so the pink pigeon said 400. Importantly, it went down to only 10 individuals. So you don't have to know a lot about genetics to know that that's basically like having a family of 10 people and then try and create the whole human population from that. That's not very many. So they suffer from that. They suffer and they have very high mortality. They don't have any resistance to an introduced disease. They have a whole host of other pressures as well, such as predators, a lack of habitat and lack of habitat and natural native vegetation for food. But luckily for them, in the 1970s, Gerald Durrell came along, and from then we started a conservation program. And what this meant was that they dealt with the predators, they dealt with the invasive species, and they really bred these animals. They tried so hard, so it was a success. They went from 10 to 400. However, there's probably could do a little bit better. They're not increasing as much as we'd like, and modelling that we have done has shown that if you were to leave them alone, or just, at the 400 they are now, within about 50 years they'd go extinct. So what that shows us is that the answer to why they might not be able to be fully self-sufficient might be in their DNA. And so that's what I'm looking at. I'm looking at all of their DNA, so their genome, the collection of all the genes that code for everything from disease resistance to how fertile they are, all that information, and I want to use that to find the best way to manage these birds so that hopefully in the next 50 years we'll still have pink pigeons. And importantly, what we learn from the pink pigeon can really inform other species who haven't had conservation projects since the 1970s, don't have 40 or 50 years to wait for us to get all the data we need, but we can apply what we've learned with them to a whole host of other species and hopefully use that information to save a lot of other species. Thank you.
Thank you, Camilla. And so what, from a personal point of view, what got you into conservation and wanting to look after endangered species?
I have known what I wanted to do since I can remember. I never wanted to be anything else than work with animals. I never wanted to be a vet. And at the age of 14, I discovered what a zoologist was, and that was it, really. And anyone who loves nature and animals can't help but be struck by the state we're in today and can't want to basically help them any way they can. So a lot of my research is evolutionary. It's purely, I actually do software design at the moment. It's stuff that's interesting to me. But at the end, my end goal is to give something to conservation to try and help animals, just because basically the more you work in this sort of field, the more you realize that it needs to be all hands on deck, really.
Great, thank you. Vicky, Dewar Fowler.
Hello. Hey, so as Lewis says, I'm Vicky. I'm based at the British Antarctic Survey, which is where I'm doing my PhD. I'm also joint with the University of East Anglia. So British Antarctic Survey can't award degrees, but UEA can. So hopefully get my degree from them. So I'm a marine biologist. At the moment, I'm looking at tiny animals known as zooplankton and how they move in our water column. And the reason I'm doing this is so that we can try and understand how much carbon they're taking from the surface water that is dissolved into the water from the atmosphere, and they're taking it down into the deep layers of the ocean. Once it's on the deep layers of the ocean, it's much harder for that to get back into the surface waters, and hopefully that carbon can then never get back into the atmosphere. So I like to think of my little zooplankton as helpers in our climate change world, but we don't know how much they're helping. And so my PhD is trying to resolve that issue and trying to work out how much their movement helps us. So that's where I am. But before I moved up to the British Antarctic Survey, I was down in Exeter researching plastics and how the plastics are impacting upon our marine organisms. So that's my background is very much an ecotoxicology one, from how human problems are affecting our wildlife.
Thank you, Vicky. And so from a sort of personal point of view, Vicky, what got you into wanting to work in marine environments?
I think for me, so I think it's possibly down to my parents. My mum was a swimmer. Me, my brother, and my sister were swimmers. I'm incredibly comfortable in the water, so it seemed natural to me that I wanted to scuba dive, and I became fascinated with the marine world, and that's kind of where it's been. I told my dad when I was 9 that I wanted to be a marine biologist. Obviously, I kind of went down other paths before I got there, but I've now come back around to that, and I think for me it's that idea of helping the world again in marine.
Okay, thanks very much. Okay, Sarah Barnsley.
Hi everyone, can you hear me? Yeah, brilliant. Okay, so as Lewis said, my name is Sarah Barnsley, and I'm currently doing a PhD at the University of East Anglia, looking at how we can increase the food supply for pollinators like bees, butterflies, moths and hoverflies in UK agricultural landscapes. And this is important not only because I think they're great creatures in their own right, but also because they pollinate a lot of the crops that we rely upon to eat, and many of the plants that we enjoy in our parks, our gardens, and the wider countryside. So I'm here today to discuss with you a bit about why I think it's important to make agriculture sustainable and the role that it can play in enhancing and protecting wildlife, habitats, and our environment. And there's many good things already happening in the agricultural sector, for example, with farmers starting to focus on increasing the health of their soil, increasing their crop diversity, and managing their farming systems so that they can both achieve productivity and maintain biodiversity as well. But there are also a lot of issues that remain, with soil erosion continuing every year, 56% of UK species having declined since the 70s, and many threats from climate change as well. And with 3/4 of UK land under agricultural production, I think it's really important to put it as a high priority within the sustainability focus. And sustainability, to my mind, means a holistic system which can continue indefinitely, both in terms of providing the food requirements of a population, but also in terms of maintaining a healthy environment and wildlife populations. So whether through the adoption of systems of integrated pest management, which use pesticides as a last resort rather than a first resort, or through increasing wildlife habitat on farm, there's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all approach to sustainable agriculture, but I think that there's a lot more that everyone could be doing to increase the sustainability of our farming systems. And I think that that includes us as well, whether through supplementing those actions that are implemented by farmers, like providing spaces for nature in our own gardens, or making sure that the produce we buy is from a sustainable source. And I'm sure that we'll discuss lots of these points this evening. So thank you, and I hope you enjoy the discussion.
Thank you very much. So just to, to get a bit of an idea about how you've got here, what was your route in what makes you want to study sustainable agriculture? Why was it?
Well, I grew up in the mountains in the Swiss Alps, and there they use a very extensive form of agriculture, which you see lots of wildlife alongside the. They use a transhuman system which has been in place where the cows go up the mountain in the summer and then they go back down the mountains in the winter. And to me, with that very extensive, low-impact system, it's a system that's been able to continue for hundreds of years. And so as I grew up, I didn't see why sort of agriculture all across the world couldn't do that as well. And that's what inspires me to see how we could make all agricultural systems sustainable.
Wonderful stuff. So, any questions for our panel about what they do here? Anybody got any questions for them? All right, let's crack straight on with the questions that you've sent in. And so throughout, we'll have a discussion through each question, and then we'll open it up. And if you want to input something, feel free to sort of stick your hand up as we go, and I'll try to clock you. Okay, so our first question tonight is from Bethany. Is Bethany here tonight? Bethany sent in 4 fantastic questions. It's a shame that she couldn't make it, but they're really good. So Bethany's first question is, do you think that we'll be able to reverse the damage that humans have caused to the planet? So before we go to the panel, let's sort of get a bit of a vibe for whether the crowd here are kind of optimists or pessimists. So do we think that we're going to be able to reverse environmental damage, or do we think that we've gone too far? So who thinks in this audience that that the environmental damage that we've done to our planet is reversible? Who thinks that we've gone too far and we're all doomed? Oh, Christ, a miserable bunch. But hopefully tonight we'll discuss some of the ways that we might be able to address some of the environmental problems that we're facing, and maybe even turn 1 or 2 pessimists into optimists. So, panel, are we pessimists or optimists? We're going to start with Vicky.
Hey, so I'm possibly more on the pessimistic side. No, I don't believe we can completely reverse the damage that we've done. I do believe that there is some optimism in the fact that we can mitigate that damage. We can reduce our pollution. We can do things to change the way the projections are going. It's going to take a lot of work, but I do believe we can do it. So, for example, with the plastics, we've woken up to the problem. Now is the time to find the solutions to limit the damage they can cause in future. I think that's how we need to look at things from now on.
Very good. Camilla. Oh, we've got a question here already. We'll come to you in a minute. We'll get a view from the panel, and then we'll come out.
I want to say I'm down the middle. I think we can't wave a magic wand and make it go back to what it was before, because extinct is forever. There's a reason there are no dinosaurs walking around, exception, I was going to say crocodiles. However, in terms of biodiversity loss, it's very similar to what Vicky says. Now's the time to act. And for example, in Mauritius, which is obviously where my study species is, so I know more about the system there, they do a lot of island restoration. So what Carl Jones, who's a professor, what he said is, he said, look, this island is not going to be like it was. They've got little islets off the main island. However, we have a rough idea, because humans wrote everything down, right? We have a rough idea of what it was meant to be, but there's a tortoise species that's extinct. So why don't we just put in another tortoise species? And everyone went, you can't do that, because that tortoise species was never in that place, it was in that. He said, look. And basically what his point was is, you can make things back to almost the way they were in some instances, but you have to be a bit flexible in your thinking and a bit innovative. And I think now is the time to always think things through, never do anything rashly, obviously, and just go, we're just going to throw these species everywhere and see where they land. No. But now is the time to act, as Vicky said, and to think, well, all right, we might not be able to get this area of land back exactly how it was, but how can we make it healthier, more biodiverse, better than it is now? And why not do it? I mean, often now the worst that can happen is already happening. So you might as well try. And I also very much believe what Vicky said is that someone pointed out to me today that humans are causing all these problems, yeah. And in previous episodes of mass biodiversity loss, they were bad, but they didn't have humans, which is, right, we are the cause, but we also have the solutions. We have the technology, we're starting to get the will. We need a bit more of a push. So I don't think it's completely dire, but I think that coming to terms with the fact that we have lost species, we have lost almost ecosystems that we might not get back, and that's on us. So I think I would like to say I'm down the middle, more optimistic, because come on, guys.
Okay, Sarah.
Okay, so from an agricultural perspective, about half of land that is livable is already being used for farming. And unfortunately, a lot of this is very unsustainable. For example, relying heavily on inputs like pesticides, fertilizers, and so on that are damaging to nature. But I also think that there are a lot of solutions to all these issues. So at the moment, I'm optimistic. I don't know how long I'll stay optimistic. But for example, the Regeneration International Body and the Nature Friendly Farming Network are very good organizations to look at in terms of examples of farmers that are doing some very good work for reversing the damaging impacts that conventional agriculture has had upon the environment. And there is a movement now towards integrated farm management, which takes a whole system approach where you consider every angle of production in a holistic way, from energy efficiency to soil management and so on. And you can have different layers within that as well. So I mentioned in my talk at the beginning the integrated pest management, which means that you consider those different angles of managing pests, including increasing crop diversity, and increasing habitat for natural predators and so on before you use pesticides. So because using pesticides doesn't actually solve the problem, it only stops it temporarily, but it's not actually addressing the issue. And there's a lot of new technologies and developments coming out now as well. I had a stand earlier today in the forum, which was talking a bit about precision agriculture. And I think that that can have a part to play as well. So, for example, keeping again on the theme of pesticides, if you can build up a map of where pest pressures are in a field, precision farming software allows you to only apply those pesticides where the pressure is greatest. So it reduces, rather than at a blanket rate across the whole field, and so it reduces the amount that you're using, and you can use precision farming for different inputs as well. But I do also think that you need to get everybody, and that's both farmers and consumers, thinking with the same mindset of how we can move towards sustainable agriculture, and we're only going to succeed if we can get everybody changing their mindset to living sustainably.
Great, thanks very much. So it seems like we're quite clear that we're optimistic in terms of the sort of technological developments and the scientific developments that we might be getting to helping us deal with environmental problems, and perhaps less optimistic about whether there's necessarily the political will to engage with these things. So there's a chap here that had a question in the audience. Have we got the mic?
Hello. I've got a question for Sarah with regards to agricultural sustainability. You raised some very good points there, and 100% behind all of those. And I think that global food security is going to be a massive issue for the future as populations continue to rise, at least for now, and climate change is reducing the available land to farm. Now, one of the biggest issues that I think we're going to face in the future, and I would like your opinion on, is how do we balance the amount of land that is required for food resources, as well as about the amount of land that is currently under demand for renewable biofuel sources in the sort of global attempt to try and reduce the carbon emissions, or at least offset the carbon emissions that we're actually going to face? How can we feed the world as well as produce the fuels that we need as a modern society whilst limiting the amount of carbon output that we have? Is that something that you've got a view on?
yes, I agree. Getting the balance between sort of energy production and food production can be very complicated. And I don't necessarily think that turning towards, using up more land space to grow crops is necessarily an approach that can be used everywhere, because I don't think we'd be able to produce enough to be able to create enough energy to provide energy for everyone. But I think there are other approaches that could work. So one thing that's being looked into now is whether, and I'm sure everyone's aware of some of the impacts that are associated with livestock agriculture as well, and there's more people are looking into how much you could use sort of manure and waste products in terms of energy production, and I think that that kind of approach would be more sensible than trying to use up more land for growing crops when we do also need to meet the food requirements. But in terms of food requirements as well, we actually produce enough food globally to feed every single person on the planet. So we have 800 million people, that are starving in the world, but 40% of the food that we produce actually goes to waste globally, and the figure is the same across developing countries and developed countries as well, and it's for different reasons. But if we manage to stop 100% of food waste, we would actually have enough to feed the entire world and reduce the farming land area as well. So the solutions are there. It's just a matter of getting everyone to, again, change their mindset and stop wasting food and things as well.
Great. Thanks very much. Okay, I think we can rattle straight on to our second question, which is from Jackie, who's asked a question about global warming. Is Jackie here tonight? Hi, Jackie. Thanks very much for your question. Are you happy for me to read it out? Okay, so Jackie's asked, people have said to me, we've had a great summer, thank goodness for global warming. Are terms like climate change and global warming unhelpful terminology in the UK? So some climate activists suggest that terms like climate breakdown or climate catastrophe might be more appropriate terms for actually the nature of climate change. Sarah?
Yes, so there's a new intergovernmental panel on climate change report that came out recently, and it had a very stark warning in terms of what the impacts of climate change could be, depending on whether we keep the Earth's core temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius. And a key point that was made was that there'd be more instances of extreme weather, with, for example, an 100% increase in flood risk if we keep the Earth's core temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And I think this point about extreme weather is the one is why that terms like global warming can be confusing for people, because climate change doesn't necessarily mean that we'll just see hotter summers all the time. It means that we'll have more extreme weather events as a whole. And last winter's Beast of the East is a classic example of that. So the worrying thing I think about climate change is the unpredictability of when events will be and how to handle that.
Great. Camilla?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point about especially global warming, because we've all heard it said, if it's global warming, how come it's colder in the winter? Because I think that's another thing that people are quite happy to report on summer highs, and then it'll be the winter lows, and then it'll be the autumn floods, and we love our records in this country. There was a whole program on TV once. I think in terms of the terms themselves, I think global warming is definitely a confusing term, and it's a term that people have hidden behind to excuse, when people were trying to say it was a myth. I think climate change is a good term. I think it gets confused again with, well, climate change is natural. Historically, we've had ice ages and not ice ages. I think in terms of the best terms to use, I honestly don't know. But what I would hope is that one of the things I think I see increasingly in studies is there are people looking psychologically. So they're looking at these terms and looking at human psychology and how best almost to, I don't want to say market, but almost to market it. So I wouldn't be surprised if we do see new terms coming out. But I think it's such an important topic, we don't want to mishandle it. So I honestly don't know what a better term would be, but I'm really hoping that people will look into that and think of a better way, essentially, of marketing it to get everybody. At this stage, we need everybody on board. So I think it's a really interesting point about the choice of words and the understanding behind them.
Great. Vicky, you have anything to add?
So I agree with both my panellists. I think climate change is a useful concept, as that is just referring to change on the climate if you break it down. I think what we don't necessarily have is that people fully understanding the impacts of climate change. They just think it is global warming, and I think they do get confused between the two. So I agree that maybe we do need some new terms, but at the same time we have to be very careful. As from a scientist's point of view, we come up with so many different terms for so many different things. People switch off. So we kind of almost need to refine the terms we have and make sure that everyone is on the same page with it. As Camilla was saying, we need everybody to understand. We need them to understand that climate change refers to more extreme events. I mean, I do a lot of my work in the poles. I was up in the Arctic and I could see where the glaciers had been and where they are now, and that's as an impact of climate change. And we need to get people to understand that that is what climate change means, rather than just Britain's getting hotter. I think that's where I stand, is that it is kind of confusing, but if we define it better, maybe that will help.
Okay, great stuff. So we've got a question from the audience here, or a point.
Good evening. Hello. Hello. Vicky, you said keeping the core temperature of, the Earth at a core temperature to stop global warming, but global warming has gone up and down. There's always been an ice age. It's always changed. I mean, I know we're not helping the situation with various pollutions and one thing and another, but do you not also think that there's no stopping it? You can't. You might slow it down by a small iota. Plastics in the oceans is a different kettle of fish. I don't think that's responsible necessarily for global warming, but it's not helping. But how are we going to keep the core temperature? It can't be done. It's for millions of years, climate has gone up and it's gone down. How are we going to keep this core temperature? You said the core temperature. I just want your view on how you're going to keep this core temperature, because I don't think it's possible. Sorry, that's my question.
It's a good question. So, Vicky, what do you think?
I'm inclined to agree that we can't stop it changing. There has been a lot of natural variability over the past millions of years. The climate has warmed, it has cooled. We've had ice ages, we've had hot things. The difference we've got at the moment is the rate of change, and that's why the planet is struggling. That's why species are going extinct at a much faster rate than we've ever known before, is because the rate of warming is too fast for those species to adapt to. We can see it in the marine environment with the marine animals. They're shifting polewards. When they get to the top of the world or the bottom of the world, they have nowhere to go. They're going extinct. In previous times when the climate has warmed, these animals have had time to evolve and adapt to these new scenarios. Here we don't have that because we are pushing it too far. And I think plastics is very different, and it's just another stressor that is in the marine environment at the moment, and we're now finding it more and more in other environments other than the marine.
Just to add to that really briefly, I think it's really important because as scientists we are used to saying in evolutionary short times or in geologically short period of times, but to put that in context, that's millions of years. So the previous warming happened over tens of thousands, over millions of years, and the current warming has been happening over sort of in such an increased rate, like Vicky was talking about, in about 200 years. So just to give you some idea of sort of the difference in scales that we're talking about.
Okay, so we just got another point here.
So as a chemist, I can't help but look at this from an equilibrium perspective, where we have an equilibrium between the current environmental rate of change and how it's been historically. Do you feel that potentially there could be a point where the equilibrium is outbalanced by the human input from it, or do you feel that there could be a balance to the human input from the changes that we're making?
Any of the panel want to address that?
So is that about basically like, is there a tipping point where we're gonna?
Yeah. So is there a point where the human input to the equilibrium could change to outweigh the natural input from the equilibrium?
Yeah, I think. Do you want to? come in.
I mean, this is less kind of my area of expertise in terms of, but yeah, if you.
Yeah, so I mean, yes. Essentially, the short answer is yes. In biodiversity loss, you see it massively. I mean, we're in the 6th mass extinction, which is almost entirely caused by humans. Again, just because of the rate it's happening at, it's almost unprecedented in previous time. So yes, humans are a tipping point now. The IPCC report that Sarah mentioned, basically 2 degrees seems to be that tipping point. 1.5 degrees is not great. I mean, if we could avoid that, but it's the difference between the two is disproportionate. So it's 5.5 degrees different, and the differences you will see in sort of sea ice, extreme weather events, coral bleaching, all these things that everyone hears about is disproportionate to that increase. So I think, yes, humans very much are tipping the balance. They're shifting that equilibrium, definitely. But yeah, hopefully we can also be the ones to shift it back. I don't know if it's similar in agriculture, Sarah?
Yeah, I was just agreeing with my panelists in terms of what the climate change report says. So the 2 degree tipping point is the one that we need to worry about. And I think there is a lot we can do in terms of agriculture and mitigating greenhouse gas emissions as well. So the livestock industry is there's a lot of greenhouse gas emissions from the livestock industry, but there is a lot of research going into how we can reverse some of that as well. So for example, 20% of the livestock greenhouse gas emissions actually come from fossil fuel use from various supply points along the supply chain. And so if we turn to renewables, for example, we'd actually cut out 20% of the livestock greenhouse gas emissions, and there's various different other examples like that of how we could reduce the greenhouse gas emission that way as well. So I guess whether or not we're coming to a tipping point or not, the point is we don't want to risk that happening, so we need to make change now as well.
Okay, so sorry, that leads to my second question, which is, would you weigh human life greater than that of the cost of the environment?
Everyone knows we are being live streamed, so no. It's a really, really hard thing, okay? I'm a scientist. I believe in logic, rationale. I sit and I look at a computer all day and I look at numbers. If you were to present me with the numbers, then yes, right? But I'm also a human. I'm a member of this society. I have a phone with mind things in it. I eat meat. I'm not a vegetarian. I'm not perfect at all. So it's a really difficult question to answer in terms of the data would say yes, being very blunt. But we're human, right? So the answer to that is no. So I'm afraid I can only give you that answer because...
I mean, do we think this is an actual dichotomy here? I mean, does human life not depend to some extent on the environment?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point, because obviously we're reliant on the ecosystem services. I mean, the water we get, the rain cycle, all these things, the nitrogen, everything we depend on, bar perhaps Twitter, is provided by nature. And so Lewis is quite right. We're part of this as much as anything else. We need these services as well. And perhaps now they need us as well.
So, sorry, are you saying that we've reached a point where humanity is so integral to the ecosystem that removing us would be detrimental to the ecosystem?
No.
Okay, so let's move on now.
No.
In that case, yeah, that was just more or less one of my questions. So thank you very
Apparently,
much.
the pets would. If we were to, did anyone see a program a few years back on what would happen if humans disappeared in a day? The Earth would recover. I mean, the Earth's been here for a lot longer than we have, right? So of many, many species. But pets would suffer because they'd be all locked inside and wouldn't be able to eat. So no, but I'm a human, and I don't believe we should measure human life like that against the ecosystem quite so rashly. But I can see an argument for it if you're going to give it in numbers.
So we've got a very related question following on, which is why I'm sort of trying to move it on. The next question is very much related to this. So this is anonymous. It might have been you. He says, "Aren't people the problem, and shouldn't we control the human population?" Is what somebody asks. So, Camilla, do you want to start, seeing as you're on here at the moment already?
People are going to get really bored with my voice. Briefly, yeah. So yes, And anyone who wants to hear someone much better than me talk about it, go to our collective grandfather, Mr. Attenborough. He speaks really wonderfully about this in a recent lecture he gave a couple of years ago. Yeah, there's too many people. We're putting too much strain on the earth. We're going to find it hard to support our own population, let alone that of everything else. But the answer doesn't lie in putting a value of a human life against another. A lot of the answers are within our own population. It's about educating people. It's about contraception. It's about quite simple things, actually, to give people the choice. Say, this is what's happening in your world, the world you live in. We need a smaller population. So think about that when you're planning your family. Not forcing anyone to do anything. No one's suggesting anything like that. But educating people, letting people know, as I think Vicky or Sarah, both of them said earlier, make sure we're on the same page. This is what's happening. These are the choices you can make that will help. And as I've said before, we're also the ones who are coming up with the technology to try and fix these problems. A lot of them we have created. So yeah.
Okay. Any of the other panel want to input into this? Sarah?
Yeah, so I agree. I think that you can enter quite dangerous sort of moral territory with this kind of question, and there have actually been attempts in the past globally to control human populations as well, thinking about China's one-child policy, for example, and that didn't end very well. So I think you have to, you have to be very careful when you're discussing these kinds of questions. And I think it's also important to remember as well that when countries develop in terms of infrastructure, education, healthcare, and so on, that people actually tend to have fewer children. So, in many developed countries around the world, the population is actually stabilized or even decreasing. So perhaps part of the answer is to be able to help countries that are still developing to do so in an environmentally friendly way. And that's another way of addressing a lot of the issues that we're facing.
Great stuff. Vicky?
Yeah, so I also agree with the other panellists. I believe that it is dangerous territory to start suggesting that we control population. But I do believe that population growth is a factor in our in changing the climate. I mean, we have I think it's called an Earth Day, which is where every year we start from the 1st of January, then we use all the resources that the Earth can sustain for a year. And if we've already passed that this year, I think it was possibly in August that we basically used up, Camilla's saying, 1st of August, that we surpassed that date. So that means that we're using borrowed resources essentially for the rest of the year. But I agree with them in that I think education will be the key to solving this problem. I think you need to educate people so they're aware of what they're doing, and then access to facilities, access to family planning may help, may not always. I mean, it's completely a personal choice as to whether you contribute to population growth or not. Like, that's completely personal, and we should never say yes or no to anyone. We should just give them the option.
Okay, and then we get it. You're putting you into some sort of difficult moral territory here. There's a question at the back.
Thank you. Good evening. Well, I think there are several steps we can take before we are trying to achieve a population reduction. So I think it's much easier to say to people to reduce consumption of meat, reduce consumption of plastic, than to say you are only to have one child or two. So I think controlling population should be, we should only think about it when we solve all of our other issues, such as excessive consumption and all. So maybe we do that first, and then we try and figure out if we need to reduce our population or not. Yeah, I think with 8 billion people, maybe we can do it if we do it sustainably. So we don't need to all of our population.
Okay, I think that's a great point. We should maybe get our own house in order before we start talking to other people about how they reproduce. Any thoughts on that from the panel?
I agree with that. I think the first step we do need to take in all of these problems is to reduce our consumption. We do live in a world where we take a lot from the environment. We take a lot. We produce a lot. In the developed world, we waste a lot of food because we're taking a lot of food. So if we can reduce what we use, that will definitely help. And I think if we can sort that, we can move on to the next stage. So I completely agree with your point there.
Okay, great stuff. Got another point here, and
Sorry, so from what you've said already, essentially what you're asking is for humanity to deny its biological imperative of spreading itself, where you're deciding for the individual to, instead of reproducing, to not reproduce. If all of humanity did reproduce, then how would that impact the current climate models? And if humanity decided to not reproduce and to control its current rate of reproduction, how would that affect the climate models as well?
anybody want to want to address that?
I'm going to give you an answer of what is my opinion, because the IPCC report is in depth, even for scientists, environmental scientists. Essentially, the way we're living is overcapacity now, and it's not just enough. I do agree we should reduce our consumption, but current reports say that that's not enough. I mean, we don't really have enough time to do that, see if it works, get an order out. So we need a multi-pronged approach where we need lots and lots of different approaches all at once, because we are over capacity. We might be able to support this many people on Earth, fine, but not the way we're living now. And I think the IPCC said this all needs to happen within about 12 years, which isn't very much. So the models as they are, I think I've read somewhere recently that we can support the amount of people we have now. I think our population's doubled in the past 40 years or something. I can't remember, but very short period of time, we've doubled from 3 billion to 7 billion, which if you think of that in terms of growth is crazy fast. It's a scientific term. So I don't know is the short answer. The longer answer is I think the models show now we could live with what we have if we live a certain way, and all this changes, but that requires behavioural changes from almost everyone on the planet. We may be able to support some more people, but again, a lot of this depends on how we choose to live as well. And definitely with fewer people, it would be much more comfortable, but not if all those people lived in a certain way. It's a balancing act, I think, essentially. But at the moment, we're definitely over capacity on everything we use and how we use it.
Okay, let's move on. We'll keep going through. Otherwise, I think we can get caught up in population growth a bit too much. And so, next question is for Sarah. So we've got a farming-based question, and this is: what is the problem with our current farming practices, and how can we become more sustainable with our farming? So it's a broad farming question. Sarah.
Okay. Well, agricultural intensification increased dramatically sort of in the era following the Second World War, when there was a lot of food shortages, and so there was a need to increase production greatly during that time. But this led to a lot of issues as a result. For example, having large monocultures, which are areas of a single crop and very little other diversity, and heavy use of chemicals, as I was saying before, like pesticides, fertilizers, herbicides, and so on, which all have a negative impact upon biodiversity. And this subsequently impacts upon the services that are usually provided by nature, and which are underpinned by having a healthy diversity of species. So from the gathering of carbon in the soil and nutrients to pollination, populations of earthworms that cycle nutrients in the soil, and so on. And so it becomes a vicious circle where if you have less services being provided by nature, you then rely more on external inputs like the chemicals that you use in intensive agriculture. And so what I think we need now is a shift within all of society, as I was again saying before, both within the farming community, but also outside. So to change the mindsets that we can start to reverse that cycle and build the biodiversity back into the farming system. And this is starting to happen. So one approach that's aiming to do this is called ecological intensification. And this approach aims to increase yield by working with and enhancing those services that underpin nature. And so by definition, it means increasing biodiversity on your farming system. And as I said, there's a lot of research happening in this area, and there was a study carried out a few years ago by a man named Richard Pyrewell and his colleagues, and that demonstrated that if you took 8% of land out of farming systems and turned it to wildlife habitat, that you actually maintained the same yields within the fields simply because you were bringing back some of those ecosystem services. So I think there are ways to reverse the circle, but it's a matter of getting everyone on board with that.
Good stuff. Any other thoughts from the panel on that? All happy? Any sort of thoughts about problems with farming on here? So anybody up the back first, and then we'll come to you. That's all right. We're just trying to get a few different opinions in.
Yeah, so in a British context, obviously a lot of our sort of farming conservation side of things and sustainable agriculture comes through the Common Agricultural Policy and European-led. So in a post-Brexit world, how are we going to continue in the UK doing sustainable farming and conservation?
Well, that's a very good question. And actually, the agriculture bill is going through Parliament at the moment. It's gathering evidence. DEFRA is gathering evidence at the moment as to what the new agricultural bill should look like. And actually, the shift is going to be more towards public services. Payments for public goods and services, so ecosystem services included within that as well. So in order for farmers to keep receiving the support and the subsidies that they are currently, they're going to have to show that they're making a difference for the environment and for ecosystem services. So this is what is happening at the moment, but of course it's very difficult to know, depending on what trade agreements receive and how much money will actually be available following Brexit, whether that will be implemented or not. And to be honest, I don't have the answer to that yet. But at the moment, it's looking positive. So.
Okay. Take this point here, and then you. Okay. Okay.
Sorry, people probably bored of hearing my voice, but the question I had was regarding to the the economical impact of what you were talking about, where if you have the environment providing for more of the input of the agricultural sector, how is that going to impact the human input from that? I know that since the Bourne Harbour cycle was developed, we've relied on man-made fertilizers a lot more than we've relied on natural fertilizers. So will people be losing out on jobs because we've instead chosen to vote for environmental factors rather than human-made fertilizers?
Yes, so well, I guess there's two different sides economically there. So in terms of inputs on the farming system, economically for the farmer it makes sense because they're actually reducing the inputs, and so it costs them less to do that if they can get the balance back into their farming system. But in terms of the fertilizer industry and so on, and the pesticide industry and herbicide and so on, yes, it could impact them if we get enough farmers actually working towards a system of ecological intensification. But then I guess, and of course that's always a difficult situation if people are losing out on jobs, but if it's at the expense of the environment, in my opinion, I think these sectors are going to have to shift towards something else. And actually, I am part of my PhD, I'm working with an agronomy company, so they do actually give advice to farmers on how to use their pesticides and different products on farm, and they realize the way that agriculture is shifting towards bringing the environment back into the question. And so I think the fact that they are looking for someone to come in and do a PhD looking at how we can increase pollinator resources on farm is an indication that they're trying to move their focus away from purely agronomical factors and towards managing for biodiversity and things as well.
And presumably there are job opportunities associated with modern ecologically intensive farming methods as well.
Yeah, exactly. And a starting point, of course, is training people how to do that. But as you say, I agree. I think it's just a matter of the job role shifting rather than it disappearing completely. So,
was there a point at the front here? Yeah, have we got a mic?
Hi, I don't know if this is on. Yeah, it is. What are your opinions on GMOs, and do you think that political controversy and controversy within environmentalist groups towards GMOs is us just shooting ourselves in the foot?
Can we hold fire on that one,
thing.
because I think that might come up. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, cool. Okay, great. Let's move on to our next question. Okay, so we've got a question for Camilla. This is an anonymous one. So, why should we care about animal extinction, and why is conservation considered so important?
Well, there's two sides to this. There's the side that I want to be able to show my children wildlife that we have today. So there's the intrinsic value, right? It's nice to look at wildlife. We like it. We like the variety of species we see around us. There have been links to obviously mental well-being. Selfishly, I love them. But that's not enough nowadays, unfortunately, just to say, well, it's always been there. We should probably keep it. But they play a very large economical role, believe it or not. So a few years ago, the government decided to try and, I think they thought were doing a clever thing, and they sent an economist to try and work out how much the environment saved us money in terms of these ecosystem services, as we've talked about before. This sort of the pollinators, because bees work for free, right? Water cycle, the natural filtering of things, of air quality, and all these factors that we need to survive as humans. And he came back, I think converted, and said actually what the ecosystem does for us is worth trillions. And today, ecosystem services are worth £125 trillion per year. To give you some context, the GDP last year was 107. So whether or not you like animals and you think we should save them, they provide for you a service that you're not even aware about day to day. That is more than worth their weight in gold, quite literally. And finally, the other reason why we should make an effort to conserve them is ecosystems are hard, right? It's very tricky. It's almost like if you imagine a tower of Jenga, but you're playing it blindfolded. So you know that some pieces you'll pull out and the whole thing will topple. Other times you can take out 10, 20 and nothing will happen. And it's like that with an ecosystem. We don't always understand all the connections or what is important, what isn't, but we do know that it's been there for a reason. And that's why you need to conserve animals and conserve as much as possible and try and understand all these interactions.
So just to follow you up on that bit, Camilla. So if, to play devil's advocate a little bit, if we say that we're going to use the valuing of nature, if it turns out that some species aren't worth anything, should we just let them go by the by?
I think it would depend on your value of worth, Lewis. No, I think it would depend. I mean, the economic argument for conservation makes a lot of people very uncomfortable because they think that all nature has an intrinsic value. Biodiversity does more than that, more than those values. The World Health Organization values biodiversity because a lot of medicines come from plants, not just in developing worlds where they still use these natural remedies, but even for us, a lot of chemicals we use today that are in current medicines come from plants. And there's a lot of people really believe that in unexplored areas of the Amazon there's going to be loads of plants that we can find with compounds that will help a lot of modern diseases. So there's a lot of selfish reasons, not just the directly economical, that we should want to save them.
Okay. So any other thoughts from the panel?
Yes, so I agree with Camilla completely, and I do think that the role that some animals play isn't fully understood yet as well. And going back to the theme of pollinators, for example, if we lost the diversity of pollinators, as the climate changes and we are able to grow crops in different parts of the world, we might have lost, those species that could actually pollinate that crop in that part of the world. So I think there's benefits yet that we don't yet understand as well.
Okay. Vicky, you have any thoughts?
I don't have much more to add. I completely agree, although I would like to say that I think we don't just need animals, we need all the plants as well. Yeah. If we lose our trees, if we lose our photosynthesizing organisms, terrestrial, marine, we no longer have oxygen. I think that in itself is a reason to value all of diversity and all the species that we have, because every one of them has co-evolved with each other to play a role. and without them, we don't know. That's part of my PhD, is to actually try and work out what these species are doing, because we just don't know right now. And I think we can't take one out and see what happens, because who knows what the effect might be. I think that's
Okay, any thoughts there from the audience? Okay, so got the chap here.
So given the overfocus on charismatic megafauna in most conservation programs, and under current climate forecasts, quite a lot of those big guys are already done for.
Perhaps you could explain what you mean by charismatic
some
megafauna.
big, uninteresting, fluffy things, rather than the cool, interesting little brown jobs. At what point do you think you should stop ploughing money into these sort of conservation programs?
Can we hold you on that point, because that's going to come up very soon about charismatic members? Is that okay? We'll hold you off and we'll come back. We are going to come to that point.
Okay, I've got a question that, so this is something I recently heard of, but with regards to tackling the problem of climate change and actually trying to offset the carbon emissions, many of the audience will be very well aware that actually most of the carbon fixation, most of the CO2 intake from the air into other sources actually comes from algae and photosynthetic organisms in the ocean. Now, I am actually quite aware that one of the ideas that has been proposed to offset this is in fact to biostimulate the increase in biomass of these organisms that do actually fix this carbon. So it might be a bit off topic, but what do you guys think about this as a solution? Is it a magic fix-all, or is it just a band-aid?
I think maybe that's one for Vicky.
Yeah, so there's quite a few schemes. So what happens in our marine system is that the photosynthetic phytoplankton take in carbon and they photosynthesize just like any terrestrial green plants do. That's fixing the carbon. Then other animals come along and eat those photosynthetic organisms, and then it goes through the carbon chain, or it gets moved to deeper waters. This is exactly where my PhD is. So I'm trying to work out just how much carbon is taken by these tiny animals and moved to the deep ocean. We just don't know these things yet. So what you're referring to are like these schemes where, so for instance, iron fertilization into the Southern Ocean, where that is the limiting nutrient in the system, and that's what's preventing the photosynthetic organisms from growing. I don't think it is a long-term solution, because especially in the Southern Ocean, there is a landmass there, so there's a reason there's no iron there, and one of those reasons is that because it's cut off from the rest of the ocean. So everything is linked to each other. So by adding something that isn't there, I don't think you're going to solve the problem. I think you're going to add other issues, and again, we don't know, because I think a lot of this photosynthetic algae, if it is simulated, it becomes toxic. So then it kills everything. So you're reducing the amount of carbon it's actually sequestering, because it's just going to kill everything else and lead to more problems. So at the moment, I think these ideas are great in principle, need far more research, and I'm not sure that it's the right avenue to go down at the moment.
Okay, right. I think we better move on, because we've got a few more to get through if we can. Okay, next question. This one's for Vicky. So another one from Bethany, who asks, what solutions are there to plastic pollution, and how can we stop plastic from ending up in our oceans? So plastic pollution's big at the moment. We've seen a lot of it on the television. Vicky.
Yeah, so obviously we've all heard of the plastic pollution. Blue Planet brought it right into our homes last year. I think with the plastics, there's not one single solution. It's a multiple solution approach that we need to take. I think going back to one of the early questions, I think we need to reduce the amount of plastic we're producing. Not necessarily all plastic. Plastic is not evil, as we are sometimes led to believe. Plastic is incredibly useful. The problem we have here is that the single-use plastic is designed to be made and thrown away. that is one of the areas we need to look at the solutions for. We need to redesign things. We need to reduce it and reuse it. So we need to redesign things to be able to be reused and reused. And even when they do come to their end of their life, they need to have been designed so that it can be better managed in recycling, so they can go into other uses rather than just being thrown away. I mean, we know that only about 40% of our plastic is currently recycled, so what's happening to the other 60%? Well, I think Blue Planet brought that home. It's going into the environment through one way or another. Plastic is getting there. And so I think the best way of stopping plastic getting in there is to go right back to source and rethink the way we use plastic. And if we can all make that change, those changes, the simple changes, and put pressure on other people to make those changes, so such as the industries, make the changes and make plastic last, then I think we can start to stop plastic ending up in the ocean.
Okay. Any other panel members have anything to add onto that? Yeah, Sarah?
Yeah, I agree completely with everything Vicky's just said, and I also think that if as humanity we're innovative enough to come up with the idea of plastics in the first place, we're innovative enough to come up with solutions, and there are people around the world starting to look for some of these solutions, and they've come up with really clever ways of dealing with things. So there's a guy in India who, instead of using plastic cutlery every time you go for a picnic or something, he's developed knives and forks which are actually edible, and you can eat them after you finish the picnic if you so want, or if you don't want to, they're completely biodegradable. So there's people coming up with all these little solutions all the time, which I think also make a difference.
Okay, we've got a question at the very back there.
Hello, thank you for your excellent replies so far. So we have been described as living in the post-truth era. Is plastic a bauble that's being dangled in front of us to distract from larger damage that's being done to the climate system by heavy industry and associated carbon waste?
Okay, is plastic a ruse to get us all?
I don't think it's a bauble that's been there to distract us. I think it has become like the poster child, essentially. Plastic has become the poster of saving the environment. And at the moment, that is where we're focusing. We are focusing on plastics. The government have just, I think the EU have just banned several plastic items. And for governments, plastics is easy. It's easy to say, okay, we're going to phase out cotton buds, no plastic straws. That's easy. And so I think they have possibly focused on it far more than they have focused on other issues that are harder. I mean, obviously climate change, ocean acidification, biodiversity loss, farming, they are very important issues that I do think we do need to focus on. But we can use plastics and we can say, okay, look at how much we've done for plastics. Look at how much the public want to change this. We can take that momentum and apply it to our other environmental issues. So I think that's where the plastic issue is really going to help us in future, as long as we can take hold of it and move to other issues with it. I think that we can do this, but it's kind of down to us as a society to do that.
Okay, thanks very much. Right, let's get straight on to the next question. We've got a few more to get through. So, next question is related to the point made at the back earlier, and I hope this is an okay paraphrase, but somebody's asked, why is so much money spent on saving the pandas? So that's one for Camilla.
Yeah, I think Chris Packham famously said he would eat the last panda if it would mean he could recoup the money spent on pandas. Unfortunately for Chris Packham, a recent study has shown that that would have been an inadvisable thing to do. So again, there's several reasons why charismatic, particularly megafauna, but also actually bird species are particularly important. If I quickly focus on the panda, a recent study from China has shown that pandas actually give back to the Chinese both their economy in terms of ecosystem services and holds a cultural value and tourism 10 to 20 times the amount of money it costs to maintain the pandas. which is incredible. And we're talking about billions of I think either pounds or dollars. I'm sorry, I can't quite remember which, but billions, so a lot. So economically, saving the panda has been brilliant. It's been brilliant for local people. One of the reasons it's been great is China designated a lot more protected areas, but local people are able to use these areas for local agriculture, for going to get firewood. They're much cleaner, less polluted. And so in that respect, they've earned their keep. And more than that, the area the panda lives is what we say is temperate. And typically, tropical areas, like you think the Amazon rainforest, they're typically the most biodiverse. But actually, the regions that have been set aside for panda conservation, well, obviously, they conserve everything within there, right? And that's why umbrella species, what we term them, like pandas, are useful. And they found out that this region, the regions they've conserved in China, have almost as much biodiversity as tropical regions. They're incredibly diverse. So not only is it economically viable, having this charismatic species that really made the government and made the whole nation as a whole want to conserve it has probably done a lot of good for all the other wildlife. And that's quite a common argument you hear about why should we care about the panda, the tigers, all the cute cuddly things. Is, well, if you protect them, they're larger, you protect all the area they're in, you protect everything underneath them. But interestingly, I'll give you two more just little snippets which are more related to human psychology than anything else. One, people donate more. When you have a charismatic species or flagship species, something that people recognize, they've shown that people will donate more. Now, this money doesn't necessarily go to pandas. If you donate to WWF, it doesn't necessarily go to pandas, but it goes to all of their research. So it funds a much larger amount of research and conservation than just themselves. But interestingly, to your point, a study in Australia, they said to people, said, look, which of these birds do you like? They said, oh, we like them all, they're all great. Some of these unknown birds, they're very colourful, pretty. And then they said, well, which would you donate to? And they all chose the more charismatic, the larger birds that they have. I don't know particularly which species. But what the authors decided showed them was actually there could be a lot more species that we could use as charismatic species that people would then recognise. So you have to obviously introduce a species to people to recognise. And I would just say watch this space for the pink pigeon because, it's going to be the next big thing, everyone. You heard it here first.
Okay, so it seems like quite a related point to what Vicky was talking about, actually, with how do we trade off things that are attractive to the public, say saving a panda, or something like reducing plastic pollution versus the more difficult issues of conserving ecosystems. And I guess the view of the panel is that those two things aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. Any questions about saving the pandas at all?
Of course you can. How long do you have? They're an endemic species. They're only found in Mauritius off the east coast of Africa. They're related to the dodo, which is the famous extinct pigeon species of Mauritius. And they went from 10 individuals in the 1990s to now about 400 individuals. They're about the size of a wood pigeon. They're pretty unremarkable to look at. There's nothing particularly special about them other than their conservation history. And if you eat them, they can be slightly toxic, so I wouldn't recommend it. But yes, that's...
Are they pink?
They are. They're not like a flamingo bright pink. They're a dusky pink with a fox red tail and slate grey wings. They're very striking in their own way.
Okay, thanks very much. Well, let's move on to our next question, which is a related species-specific question. Somebody's asked about pandas. Somebody else has asked, "What's the point of wasps?" Which is an interesting one. So, perhaps Vicky, would you like to start with that?
Okay, so this question actually reminds me of a book. I don't know if you've heard of it, but Does Anything Eat Wasps? So that is immediately where I went to when I saw this question. So it turns out that wasps are incredibly useful, just as we've spoken about in all ecosystems being linked, all species being linked to each other. You can't remove one without a cascade of effects. So wasps are incredibly useful in pollination, as Sarah's been talking about. They provide a pollination services. They eat the nectar from plants, they go around the plants and pollinate them. They also are eaten by a surprisingly large number of animals. So we've got dragonflies, hoverflies, larger wasps, beetles, moths, spiders, and a number of birds, including willow warblers, pied flycatchers, alpine swifts, bee eaters. And then, more surprisingly, we have frogs. Love them. They will actually jump out of the water to catch them. And crabs have been reported to take a few as well. If they land on the surface where they can reach, they'll go into the rock pool and grab them. And badgers will seek them out, and they're quite a tasty snack. So wasps are incredibly useful, and there's definitely a lot of point to them. So we shouldn't just see them as these evil, stingy creatures. They are there for a reason.
Okay, thanks. Anybody else want to add anything about wasps?
Oh, no. Just really briefly, 2 points. My dog loves to chase them, so that's good. Parasitoid wasps. There's hundreds, I think, of species in the UK, and these are things that will prey and often lay their eggs in other species, typically of insects. But these are incredible creatures that will actually eat spiders, or at least not eat them from the inside out. They lay their eggs, and often I'm familiar with the ones in South Africa who I once saw a wasp, sort of not very big, drag a huge spider which was paralysed across the floor. So they have also a role in sort of a predatory role, as well as a sort of herbivory role or a pollinator role as well.
Okay, Sarah?
Yeah, I was just going to add, well, I didn't know that about the frogs. That was very, very interesting. But there's actually 9,000 species of wasp in the UK. So as Vicky and Camilla have said, some of them have a role in pollination, some of them have a role in predation as well, and as parasitoids. And I just wanted to make a point, kind of linked to the last question as well, that bees are often the poster child for pollinators, but actually there are loads of other species that have a role in pollination too that we don't often hear much about. So hoverflies as well. There's over 200 hoverfly species in the UK, and so on.
Okay, thanks very much. Question at the back about wasps.
So if it's okay with the panel, I'll start with the statement that the point of wasps is clearly the end of the sting.
Oh dear.
Secondly, so is this kind of under appreciation of ecosystem services or biodiversity roles key in the future of making change, like the agricultural or ecosystem management things the panel have been talking about? Is addressing these problems central?
Okay, perhaps Sarah, do you want to tackle that?
Yes, definitely. So I think in the last 20 years or so, a lot more research has gone into why ecosystem services are important. 50 years ago, conservation tended to just look at a species kind of in isolation to perhaps its surroundings, and now the understanding much more is that we need to have a healthy biodiversity and ecosystem base in the first place if we want to make really big changes in terms of conservation. So yeah, definitely.
Okay, great. So let's move on if we can. So we've got another question about plastics now, and it's related to a point actually that Vicky raised. So Vicky said that only 40% of plastics are recycled. Jackie has asked, why is this? And a sort of trivia question, and it's all right if you don't know this, but she's also asked what proportion of plastics are recycled in Norfolk. Does anybody know this? Do you know, Vicky?
So it's really hard to say what proportion of plastics are recycled in a certain area. It actually comes down to the specific recycling plant. So in Norfolk, depending on the area you live in, between 30 and 60% of plastics that go to the plant are recycled. I mean, this is for a number of reasons. So there's the different technologies. If they have a certain machine, they can recycle certain types of plastics. And as there are over 50 types of plastics, there's a lot of variation between the local authorities. And so only 40% on average is recycled in the UK, but in Norfolk it can vary from 30 to 60% dependent upon where you live. I think that's
Okay. Well, I think we've talked a bit about recycling. There's a question here, yeah?
Would it be economically and environmentally responsible to nationalise the recycling of plastics, or would it be better to keep it to local authorities?
Okay, it's a political question. Any thoughts on that?
I'm not sure. It's not something I've actually looked at. But what we do have is so in terms of the economics of recycling plastics, we've got the cost of taking plastics from people's houses to those recycling plants. So that's an economic cost and a environmental cost, because you've got the carbon to transport it there. So I think it would actually, sticking with the localised ones is better in that terms. But whether we could nationalise in terms of standardising rather than nationalising, whether that would be a better option. Because I know where I live, I can put almost any plastic I can put in the recycling bin. However, I was staying up in Scotland a few weeks ago, and I asked about recycling. I was like, where should I put my plastics? Where should I put my, the paper? Where should I put this? And they just said, put it all in one bin with your general waste, and it will be sorted. I'm a bit dubious as to whether that would actually happen. I can't see them going through my food waste to pick out my yoghurt pot. So I think in that way we can standardise the recycling across the country, because I think it's also confusing. So in another place in the country, you might have to separate glass from plastic. Where I live, you don't. So I go to another place and I don't know to do that, and then the recycling bin gets refused for collection. So I think that's possibly not nationalising, but standardising is the way forward.
Okay, it's a good point. A question at the front here. We'll just wait for the microphone.
With synthetic materials, the dust that's created, do you think the level of synthetic materials at atomic levels is irreversible? And how much do you think that's affecting the whole food chain, the whole system that we live in? And do you see it as a long-term effect? Well, it's a long-term effect, but do you see it, or can you envisage how that might be?
That's a very good question. So, I mean, we're thinking about microplastics here and other things. So, Vicky, have you got any thoughts?
So you're talking about the small particles that shed off synthetic material. So generally we turn anything that's smaller than 5 millimetres, that's a plastic, as a microplastic. There's more and more evidence coming out saying that these plastics are harmful, and there's more and more evidence that's saying that the smaller the plastics are, the more harmful they are. The problem we have at the moment is that we can just about find microplastics, so they're smaller than 5 millimetres. In the environment, we cannot detect, or we cannot easily detect anything that's at the nanoscale, so that's micrometers, so less than a millimetre or smaller. But there is emerging evidence to say that these are much more toxic than those microplastics. So yes, I think it is going to pose a threat. I think our challenge is now to find out how much of a threat and how long lasting that might be, because we know that once plastic's in the environment, it breaks down into smaller fragments, but it never disappears. So I think, and to answer your question, is yes, it's going to be a problem, but right now I can't say how much of a problem.
Okay, very good. If it's a quick one at the back, we'll have one here.
Yeah, I'll try and keep it quick. These microplastics, so I believe, are should be a fairly good carbon source for various microorganisms that inhabit the large proportion of this world that is in fact ocean. Is there anything we do to accelerate the evolution of these organisms that can actually biometabolize plastic? Because when all's said and done, that's part of the equilibrium of the world. I don't know. What do you think? Is that a bit simplistic?
Okay, can we get things eating microplastics?
There has been some research that's shown, I think it's so far 1, possibly 2 species can digest plastics. But when we talk about digesting, I'm hesitant to say that they're helping. The way I see it is these organisms are taking in plastics, fragmenting it, and then releasing plastics. So I don't know much about this, I have to say, but I'm not sure how well that's going to work. I mean, most of the studies we found is that plastics are eaten and then they actually have a negative impact upon those animals. So I don't know if that's a route that is worth pursuing. I'm sure there are people out there who will pursue it, and if something comes out of that, that would be amazing. But I'm not sure.
Great. So yeah, then in fact, some of that research going on in Lowestoft at the moment. Okay, so got another question about farming now, and this is from Malcolm. Is Malcolm here? Thank you very much for your question. Your question about NEP, Malcolm, was that right? So Malcolm has asked whether the panel thinks that the experiment and results that are taking place at NEP in West Sussex should form the future debate about conservation and agriculture. So for those of you that aren't familiar with this, NEP is a large estate in Sussex where they're undergoing a big rewilding project. So they've basically, it was intensively farmed, and they have allowed nature to come back basically into this large estate. And so as predominantly being a kind of a rewilding area, nature reserve, they also produce organic, kind of very, very high grade meat. And one of the managers of NEP wrote an article in The Guardian recently saying, if you want to save the world, veganism isn't the answer. So presumably she was thinking that farms like NEP are. So can farms like NEP, are they the future of conservation, and can they feed the world? Sarah?
Yeah, so I think that there's two questions really linked to the NEP project, and the first being whether it is sustainable as a model of livestock agriculture. And so this, as Lewis just said, leads into the question, the wider question of whether we should be consuming meat and other animal products as well. And one argument which is discussed often when we come to the issue of livestock agriculture is that they contribute greatly to greenhouse gas emissions. However, I think that the situation is much more complex than this, than that initial argument. So, for example, although there is no denying that livestock really do produce a lot of greenhouse gas, an issue of equal concern is soil degradation. So 70% of of topsoil globally has been eroded since the late 1800s. And that has happened largely in part because of arable agriculture. And once the soil is gone, you can't grow a crop in it, obviously. So, and actually livestock are part of the solution to this. So there's been studies that have shown that including livestock in a rotation in a mixed farming system, that they can actually very quickly build the organic matter back into the soil. And so that can help improve the soil structure and start to reduce erosion as well. Having said that, I do strongly believe that we need to reduce the amount of livestock produce that we're eating, both meat and dairy products. And this is because, for example, if you made sure that all the livestock in the world were living like they were at NEP, for example, rather than being cereal fed, you wouldn't have enough space to be able to feed all of the livestock in that way. So that's in answer to the kind of veganism side and the livestock agriculture side. But in terms, I think the second question is linked to the role that livestock can play actually in habitat management. And in terms of creating a mosaic of habitats, such as clearings in forested areas or different grass lengths, and so on. And through that, they actually provide habitats that are suitable for a lot of other species as well. And I think that the role that grazing livestock can play has been acknowledged by a lot of different organisations within the UK as well. So the wildlife trusts, for example, use a lot of grazing management because they know that it's valuable for other species as well. So in that sense, I think that the NEP estate got it right, but I don't think it's a model that you could use to... you need to get the balance between reducing the greenhouse gas emissions and managing land for biodiversity. And in terms of feeding everyone, if they still eat the amount of meat that they do, I don't think the NEP would be able to provide the answer for that.
Okay, thanks very much. Any other thoughts from the panel on NEP? Or
Yeah, I just really agree with what Sarah said. And from a biodiversity point of view, when you hear their successes, it's fantastic. But you have to be pragmatic. Even conservationists need to eat. And I completely echo what she says about using less animal products. But I think it's really encouraging to hear Sarah talk about the future of agriculture, which is not something I know a huge amount about. I know at UEA they study a lot of how this affects birds and pollinators and invertebrates. And I think it's a really important question going forward is, I'm plugging for biodiversity, but how do those two things synergize, buzzword, how do they go together? How can we move that discussion forward? Because I think you definitely see for the biodiversity, it's fantastic, it's brilliant, but it's localized. So I think habitat mosaic is a really important idea. It's an idea of having a connected, almost habitat for wildlife throughout the UK. The farms at the very least provide a corridor where biodiversity is able to flourish over the whole of the UK.
Okay, I think we're going to just keep moving because we really want to wrap up in a second. So I'm conscious that I was going to skip over it, but I'm not going to skip over the question on GMOs. So if we could very quickly have some thoughts from the panel on GMOs in response to the question here. So what do we think about GMOs as a solution to farming problems? Who would like to tackle that?
Okay, yes, so this is not really a topic I know a great deal about. So I will say that my views are completely biased to one book I have read recently, which happens to be Alice Roberts' Tamed. And that completely changed my view on it. I had been brought into a scandal around it, how it was bad, how all these genes might get out into the world. But she actually broke it down, and she said, chickens. There was a competition in America to find the chicken that was tasted the best and laid eggs. And now most of our chickens come from that line, and that is a form of genetic engineering. It's domestication. That is kind of the non-nasty side of genetic engineering. It's just the the domestication and the selective breeding that we have in a lot of things around us. So I think with the GMOs, we have to be careful about the definitions we use. Genetic engineering, genetically modified organisms are quite different things. I think they're not necessarily bad, but we do have to be careful. And I'm kind of hoping that Sarah may have more of an insight for you. But to me, I would highly recommend reading about it and forming your own opinion, and then seeing what you think about things, and maybe changing the way the world views genetic engineering, because it's not as bad as we have been led to believe, I think is my take-home message.
So Sarah, perhaps just some fairly quick thoughts, if you have any on GM.
Yep. So I agree with what Vicky said in terms of GMOs often get a bad press, but when you're facing enormous pressures, like we've discussed a lot about climate change tonight, I think being able to engineer crops that can tolerate drought conditions and other sort of extreme environmental conditions could be really important, and that's why it's also really important to maintain the genetic diversity of different crops as well. And there are actually many different crop varieties that we no longer use, but that are still in existence, and you have organisations like the Crop Trust that are working to preserve this genetic variety, and they could have an important role in the future with climate change in adapting to some of the new conditions. So I think for things like climate change, that they really could be part of the answer.
Okay, so we've got a thought on genetic modification here. If we just get the microphone over.
Hello. It strikes me that salvaging the environment is really a question of economics, and if sort of money drives all these changes that you've been talking about, and we've been told we need to stop consuming, but everything we consume is a job for somebody. So I would really like to know what the panel thinks, what jobs we're all going to be doing if people aren't making things for each other.
Okay, very good question. So, are we going to result in reductions in jobs as a result of reductions in consumption?
I think it's a really fair question, and it's one that comes up quite a lot. There's two answers to this. I think Lewis touched on this briefly earlier, in that there will be job creation. I mean, throughout history, there have been professions that disappear and professions that rise. And of course, throughout this, there's going to have to be major changes unless all the global changes that are predicted, and you want to prevent those, basically. That's the underlying statement of the IPCC report, is this is happening. How bad it happens is up to everyone. So yes, it's obviously awful to say people might lose their jobs, their livelihoods, and the impact that will have throughout families and communities. The difference is, as a community, we're seeing this problem, and those people are part of it. So I believe the solution to this is to include them in the discussion, say, look, we need to veer away from this. That if we do not, this is the answer. If you can find other solutions, brilliant. Include them in the discussion. Include them in, okay, well, don't just assume they're going to find other jobs. Be there from them from the very start to say, okay, well, we're going to have, if we want to do this, where will these people we train? How can we use them? Because there's definitely going to be a lot more jobs. All these technologies, all these innovations, they require people power. So there will be jobs. People might have to retrain. But I think, to me, the key is to have them, everyone, as Vicky said before, on the same page, having the discussion right from the beginning.
Okay, that's great. I think we better start thinking about wrapping up, because it's 8 o'clock, and I'm sure you want to all go home and have a cup of tea or go and have a pint. So we'll finish off just with a really quick one, again from Bethany, who has asked, and I think if we can just keep this to one sentence or so, if we can, what's the most important thing that everyone can do to become more environmentally friendly? I think it's a good finishing point on a positive. So, Vicky, perhaps if you could start with that.
So I find this a really hard question. I find it really hard to narrow it down to the most important thing, as I think that varies from person to person. But I mean, I think from the tone of this thing, it is making the choice that you think is right. So whether that is reducing, recycling, reusing, it's making that choice and making the informed choice. And I think that's the most important thing you can do, is make that choice.
Okay, Sarah?
Yes, so I agree with Vicky. I think it's very hard to narrow things down to a single thing, because I think there's lots of little things that we could be doing in our daily life every day. But from a consumer perspective, I think one of the things that really strikes me is how much food waste we have, with 40%. And for me, I think that's a really big thing that's quite easy to change in our everyday lives. And so that's one that I would go with, as well as also reducing the consumption of animal products and things as well. Not necessarily in terms of veganism or vegetarianism, but just reducing how much we eat of that.
Great. And Camilla?
Yeah, I agree with these two fantastic people. I'd only add to Vicky's, make the most sustainable choice that you can. No judgments, just whatever you can, do the best. But I would say, the one thing I particularly would say is get in touch with your MP. The government are going to push all these things forward. And I've recently been told by a local MP, no, send me a letter. I want to know what's important, what we're going to put the money on. We've got this money to research. We've got this money to create these things. So please, it's at the point where everyone needs to get involved. Send an email. Norman Lamb is, I think, he's now the chair for the Science and Technology Committee, and he's for Norfolk MP. Thank you. Drop him an email. Drop him a letter. Let the government know. Get the politicians know. Tweet about it. Do anything, but let everyone know that this is an issue and we do care and we want change.
Okay, I think that's a good point to end. So can we please give our panel a round of applause? They've done very well. Okay, thanks so much for everybody for coming this evening. I hope it's been informative, and thank you all for inputting and for answering questions and putting forward your opinions. We'll leave it there. Sorry that we couldn't get to everybody's question. We got more than we could get through. But thanks again, and good night.